Is any ceasefire realistic now?
Well, you heard Zelensky talking about victory, and they're certainly, projecting steadfastness over in Ukraine. I don't know what Putin would go along with, but the point of the editorial you cite was to urge the U.S. to indeed prepare Zelensky for, at some point, making compromises that might give Putin the kind of option that a rational dictator might be tempted to accept, by which, as your report said, we mean mainly that Russia would be allowed to keep some of the territory it had sought and has seized, specifically some parts in the east populated by Russian speakers. Doubtless, it would be annoying to reward aggression this way and dangerous if perceived as appeasement. But life is trade-offs and balances, and many in the West calculate that such an outcome may be the less bad option compared to direct war with a nuclear superpower managed by a desperate war criminal willing to scorch the earth. And part of that equation is that it isn't all that crazy, because the internal borders of the Soviet Union, which became today's international borders, were not just imperfect, but specifically designed to cause trouble by scrambling different and sometimes hostile ethnic populations.
Now, President Joe Biden is visiting Japan today, and he'll also be meeting with Narendra Modi from India later on. What's he trying to achieve when it comes to the war in Ukraine in this international visit with some important international players, albeit countries that haven't been that involved in the war in Ukraine?
Look, this may be a case where it isn't all about the war in Ukraine. Japan has had a fraught relationship with Russia because of Japan's desire to see a return of the southern Kuril Islands seized by the Soviet Union right at the end of World War II. For the past decade, Prime Minister Shinzo Abe had a policy of reaching out to Putin, talking of appeasement, and trying to forge a very close relationship. His successor, Fumio Kishida, is cut from a different cloth, and in fact was surprisingly quick to join the Western sanctions against Russia, and indeed in April extended those sanctions with the Prime Minister accusing Russia of war crimes. So it seems Japan is on side, and the main issues, I think, for Biden have more to do with pan-Asian security issues, concerns including the trade alliances that the U.S. is trying to build to counter China. And I think one of the issues on the table in Japan is that South Korea, which currently has a pro-Western government, wants to be allowed into the so-called Quad group, which includes the U.S., India, Australia, and Japan. And Japan is extremely cold to South Korea because of, again, recriminations that go all the way back to World War II. Considering how Putin seems obsessed with Nazis, it's rather amazing how that conflict remains still with us today.
Right, and now another impact possibly on the war in Ukraine, or at least some of the economic consequences. A report this morning that Israel is in talks with the EU to sell its gas as an alternative to the Russian gas. We're not talking about huge amounts to start with, 1 to 2 billion cubic meters of natural gas, but that number could increase. What type of impact will that have for Israel also in its ties with Egypt, who will be involved in this deal, and also the EU?
I think it certainly could be significant, and not just for Israel, but for Middle Eastern natural gas powers as well. There's certainly potential here, despite the small numbers that would inevitably attach in the beginning. I assess that Europe's desire to not be dependent on Russian natural gas is profound and maybe permanent. Certainly for as long as Putin is around, it's clear that he has ripped up the international rulebook and cannot be trusted. So the rest is numbers and logistics. Israel's known natural gas reserves are estimated, I believe, at around 1,500 billion cubic meters, which is at least 3 times more than it needs for the next quarter century. Europe's annual gas consumption is about a third of that, of which Russia supplied about a third last year. So it does look like Israel's surplus could be put to use in Europe. And it currently only exports to Jordan and Egypt. There was always talk of supplying Europe. Ways of getting the gas to Europe would involve building a pipeline, maybe with Egypt and Saudi Arabia involved, as you suggested, maybe through Cyprus, or, and this is critical, liquefying it for transport on tankers, which can be done more quickly in the short term. The most practical path to doing that may be through facilities that, as your report said, exist in Egypt. So who knows, maybe Putin's war in Ukraine may have the effect of deepening the peace between Israel and its Arab neighbors.
Certainly, every large international event has all kinds of reverberations that are hard to anticipate when they happen, and this may be one of them, bringing some Middle Eastern countries closer together. Dan Perry, international affairs analyst, thank you again for coming on.